Well, I think we'll probably go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we know each other pretty much. I'm Father Pat Travers, former pastor here at St. Paul's and also at St. Catherine's in Petersburg. Currently pastor for the second time down in Holy Name in Ketchikan. And I'm also the canon lawyer for the Diocese of Juneau and also for the other two dioceses of Alaska. I'm kind of like the sole surviving canon lawyer here in Alaska, and so I'm doing work for all three dioceses. And it's actually very easy because I have such great staff members like Chuck and Kurt here in Juneau. But it's a great opportunity to be able to speak with you today about Amoris Laetitia, which is a document issued by Pope Francis that has been the subject of a great deal of discussion since it was issued in March. This is the book itself in its English version. Just a moment. This is the book in its English version. Amoris Laetitia in Latin means the joy of love. The official version of the document is in the Latin language, although it's been translated into many others as well, including English. And it was issued on March 19, 2016, the Feast of St. Joseph. And it is an apostolic exhortation. That's what the official title of it is, as the type of document that it consists of. An apostolic exhortation is a document that is issued by the Pope usually after an assembly of the International Synod of Bishops, when they have been considering a particular topic in the course of their sessions. The Pope will usually follow up those meetings after having considered all the points of view that were presented in an apostolic exhortation. And so this one followed the two assemblies of the Synod of Bishops on love in the family, which took place in 2014 and 2015. It's a pastoral presentation of Catholic Church teaching on marriage and the family, and it reaffirms all of the existing doctrines on marriage, what makes the marriage, the indissolubility of marriage, different requirements for marriage. And it addresses the implementation of those doctrines in the context of the Jubilee Year of Mercy, which we are reaching the end of now. And it is meant to be an opportunity to reassert the doctrines, the beliefs of the Church about marriage, but with certain pastoral additions that the Pope wanted to highlight because of the emphasis that he wants to have on the mercy of God and the inclusion of as many people as possible in the Church. In terms of its authority, this is something that's been debated quite a bit. If you read the different Catholic blogs, there are some people who think that it's just the musings of the Pope privately, but actually it is an exercise of what's called the ordinary magisterium of the Church. We've been informed of that from some official sources. Cardinal Schönborn, who was one of the assistants of the Pope in preparing this, and also in the Vatican newspaper, Osservatore Romano. There's an article that very clearly stated that this is an exercise of the teaching authority of the Church, the ordinary magisterium. It's not one of the not one of the documents that presents teaching on an infallible basis. It's not an ex cathedra declaration of the Pope that would have the value of dogma, but it does reflect a Catholic teaching to which Catholics must respond with what's called religious submission of the intellect and will, and avoid whatever is not in harmony with its teaching in the Code of Canon Law. And it's comparable in its authority to a similar document that was issued by St. John Paul II, Familiaris Consortio, which was issued in the year 1981. It also was an apostolic exhortation, followed another assembly of the Synod of Bishops. Pope Francis, in this document, both reaffirms, indeed cites very clearly from that particular document, although he also has a few evolutions in the pastoral practice that is to be followed in applying the doctrines of the Church on marriage. Now, the general content of the document is very easy. It's quite readable, by the way, for anyone who's used to reading Vatican documents and sometimes having a hard time getting through even one sentence without having to backtrack. Joy of Love is very easy to read. There are only a few places that get a little bit heavy. But most of it is a very simple language, and it's also very inspiring language, because what the Pope is trying to do is to present the Catholic vision of marriage in a pastoral and a spiritual context, so that even though he is reaffirming all sorts of doctrines, he's wanting to go beyond those to the underlying spiritual bases and the ways in which they are to be applied in concrete pastoral situations, the ones that we run into in parishes all the time. The very first part of it is an introduction, in which the Pope simply says that the context is the Synod and the Jubilee Year of Mercy. And he also recognizes that there is diversity in interpretation and application of church teaching, while a certain uniformity is important, still it's not something that has to be absolutely uniform throughout the church. He says each country or region, moreover, can seek solutions better suited to its culture and sensitive to its traditions and local needs. For cultures are in fact quite diverse. Every general principle needs to be enculturated if it is to be respected and applied. And that was something that represented his recognition of the fact that the bishops at the Synod of Bishops represented a number of different regions, all the different regions of the world, and some of them had differences of opinion that were very clearly based on the cultural situations in their particular nations. Chapter 1 is called In the Light of the Word, and it basically presents biblical perspectives on family life. It's a review of biblical teachings, largely from the Old Testament, although also from the New. Chapter 2 considers the experiences and challenges of families, and it emphasizes the need for emphasis on the power of grace. That it's not enough to stress doctrinal, bioethical, and moral issues, as important as those are, that we need to go beyond that and to try to recognize how, in applying these, we can turn to the grace of the Lord, that grace that can transcend some of the difficulties we have in applying doctrines and formulations of belief to the behavior that we encounter in our church. And then he also offers a comprehensive summary of current problems and challenges. And he addresses those, they're ones that we pretty much all know about, but he goes through some of them as kind of a preliminary to the rest of the document. Chapter 3 is looking to Jesus, the vocation of the family, and it summarizes church teaching on marriage and the family. And again, it's it follows very, very much the doctrine that has been laid out in the past concerning the indissolubility of marriage, the fact that marriage is between one man and one woman, and the fact that between baptized people, marriage is a sacrament. So all of those teachings are reaffirmed. But he does say that central to all of this always has to be the proclamation of the kerygma. Now, the kerygma is the basic Christian proclamation that God took on a human nature, came to earth, suffered and died, and rose again, and gave us salvation as a result of that. The very, very kernel of the Christian message. And he says that everything we do as a church, including what we do in connection with marriage and family life, has to lead to the proclamation of that kerygma, the proclamation of the paschal mystery. Christ that was died and risen for us and offers us eternal life. He also recognized positive elements in what he refers to as imperfect situations, including those involving other concepts of marriage from other religions and cultures, and also even cohabitation and civil marriage. And this is something that is a bit of a departure, because in pastoral practice up until now, the main current has tended to be that if a person is either cohabitating or they're in a purely civil marriage, especially if it's a second marriage, that the ideal is to end that situation, find a way to end that as soon as possible. So, for example, if a couple isn't able to, if a person is able to get an annulment of their prior marriage, then the ideal that has sometimes been presented as well, that they have to break up their current marriage, no matter whether they're children or other things, and they have to, ideally go back to their former spouse, which at the pastoral level we know is very unrealistic. And so what Pope Francis is saying is that at the same time that we recognize the imperfection in situations that fall short of the Church's teachings on marriage, we also have to recognize that there are positive elements, that there are people being nurtured in those relationships, there are children being raised very many times in the Church in a very Catholic way, and that we can't ignore those in the interests of trying to bring about a perfect situation from the standpoint of doctrine. He also emphasizes the importance of nurturing children, and also the family as the domestic church. This is a theme that he goes back into. The family is the basic unit of the church, and that the parish is a family of families. It's a group, it's made up of families, households, other organizations, as well as single people, and that the family plays an ecclesial role in salvation, not just a private one. Chapter 4 deals with love in marriage, and it's an interpretation of 1 Corinthians 13:4-7. Love is patient, love is kind. That reading that we have here at so many wedding celebrations. He goes through that with a commentary on it. He actually goes back into the original Greek and explains what all that meant. But once again, it's actually very readable and very enlightening, meaning of that passage that we hear so frequently. This particular chapter is filled with very practical pastoral and spiritual advice. It's almost like he's writing an advice column for married couples in some places. But again, very readable and also very practical information. And he focuses at one point on the transformation of married love at very different stages of life. He emphasizes the fact that what brings a couple together in their early life isn't necessarily what's going to keep them together, and that as time goes on, their love, their relationship is going to evolve in accordance with their physical changes as they age and with the changes in their outward circumstances, including whether they have children at home, where they might be located. And so he tried to emphasize the idea that married love evolves through the life of a marriage, that it's a journey. And he also emphasizes the necessity of prayer, that prayer has to be at the center of any married life, any family life, and that in order to open ourselves to all the possibilities of marriage, it's necessary for the spouses and the children to be united in prayer. Chapter 5 deals with love made fruitful, deals primarily with parenthood, and also the relationships in nuclear and extended families. So he talks a great deal about the fact that sometimes it's easy for us to think of families in a very limited sense. Certainly in our country, that's very common. But we do have to remember that other people are members of our family, including as we grow older, our brothers and sisters continue to be members of our family, our parents do, and then there are various extended family relationships that can also be very important and very meaningful in the life of faith. On chapter 6, he deals with some pastoral perspectives. This is where he speaks about the parish as a family of families. And he emphasizes the importance of preparing engaged couples for marriage, both the remote preparation, Catholic education, trying to help them to know what marriage is, to have a sound view of marriage, and then also the more immediate preparation, the marriage prep as we usually think of it during those last weeks and months, including the actual preparation of the wedding liturgy. And he then goes on to emphasize that all too often that stops when the wedding actually takes place, but that there has to be more pastoral accompaniment during the first years of marriage. That all too often young married couples are kind of out there and they're going through all sorts of different changes in their lives and finding out all sorts of new things about what it's like to be married, and very frequently the church doesn't have any organized way to assist them through that. And that's something that he would like to see. Here he talks a little bit about natural family planning, how that is something that new married couples should be helped with because of the fact that it is a challenge in our society. He also speaks about handling crises and emphasizes the importance of forgiveness and recommitment. The importance of not regarding the first disagreement or even the first crisis as being a reason to end the relationship, but rather to help the couple to strengthen their relationship through the process of repentance, forgiveness, and recommitment to their marriage. And he also says that in our society, delayed maturation due to childhood experiences is quite common. That people have had very, very negative, harmful experiences of family life as children, but that can be something that prevents them from being able to enter marriage with the fully mature attitudes that are necessary to preserve it. It's something that in the tribunal work we often deal with. That sometimes we find that people had such totally negative experiences of family life in their earlier life that they don't have any kind of model, they don't have any kind of example of what it means to actually have a real marriage and have a real family. And it's amazing that many people are able to move beyond that they are able to have really good marriages, but many others haven't been able to or haven't been willing to. Sometimes they just give up too early. And then he also speaks about the breakdown of marriage and divorce. And he, for the first time in the document, he says that this is in need of special discernment. He says here that those who are divorced and remarried outside the church are still part of the church community, and that we have to be particularly aware of the impact on their children in any sense that they are separated from the church. And he also mentions here his reform of the marriage nullity process. And I thought that I would mention that because it's something that many of you have probably heard about, sometimes in connection with Amoris Laetitia. But last fall, right around this time, Pope Francis issued a letter called a Votum Proprio. It's an apostolic letter that he issued on his own volition. And it's called Vitis Iudex. And what it did is it revised the processes for the declaration of marriage nullity in the church tribunals, which is the normal prerequisite for a Catholic to be able to have a second marriage, or for somebody who wants to marry a Catholic to have a second marriage. And what he wanted to do was to try to streamline the process, make it easier for people to have access to the tribunals. He didn't change any of the doctrine of the church on that what's to be applied in terms of determining whether the marriage is valid or not. It's, that is all the same. It's the procedures that he is trying to reform. And one of the first things he did was to say that a diocesan tribunal like ours will have jurisdiction in a case as long as one of the parties lives in that diocese. And that's a huge departure from what we used to have, because it used to be that if only the person who wanted the annulment lived in our diocese, we had to go to the diocese in which the other party lived and get permission from their tribunal to have it. And it wasn't usually that hard. They were usually more than happy to have us take the case for them. But it was a delay. It was a delay of about a month or 6 weeks. And the real problem was that only applied within a particular country or a particular area covered by a single conference of bishops. So, for example, we could only use that within the United States. And of course, here in our diocese, we have a number of people from other countries whose original marriages were in those other countries and whose former spouses are in those other countries. And basically, we were not allowed to take those cases. I don't know how many times I had to tell people, I'm sorry, we can't do this. You have to go to Mexico or the Philippines or someplace else. In Fairbanks, I know that we had people with a Korean marriage. It was too bad because in a lot of those countries, they don't have a fully developed tribunal system. And so the annulment process isn't as available as it is in our country. What Pope Francis did was to eliminate that requirement, so that now as long as the person who wants the annulment lives in our diocese, we can take the case and consider it. And then he also provided that the procedures would be streamlined a bit. One of the things he did was he said that if we find in favor of the nullity of a marriage, we no longer have to submit it to an appeal tribunal to be reviewed. In the past, we always had to send our cases down to the Seattle Tribunal. And again, they were confirmed on a regular basis, but that added again another month or 6 weeks at the end of the process. And so that has made it possible, when we do find the marriage to be null, to be able to implement that decision more quickly, usually in terms of the person being able to be baptized and received into the church, or the second marriage to take place. And then we also have a new reefer process that is very interesting. It eliminates a lot of the steps that there were. And it's supposed to be a case where the causes of nullity are so obvious, they're so apparent, that there isn't the need for all the other procedures. And this is something that canon lawyers run into all the time. We often get cases where you look at it and say, of course this is null. It's clear. There's a smoking gun of some kind indicating that. But in the past, we still had to go through a year's worth of procedures in order to find that. And what he did here was he eliminated many of those procedures. The interesting thing he did, though, was he said that in those cases, the decision is made by the bishop rather than by the tribunal. In those cases, the tribunal acts in an advisory capacity to the bishop. We have been able to process about 4 of those up in the Anchorage Tribunal, and that's exactly what we did. We had a very, very abbreviated process. It was a case both where there were cases in which both the evidence was very, very clear, and also both members of both parties agreed that the marriage should be declared null. That's another prerequisite for that. And Archbishop Schweitz took papers that we drew up, and he made the decision, and then we did the final sentence or decision, and we were able to get those out in about 3 months, which is much, much shorter than the time that annulment cases usually take. And then, again, the fact that we don't have to send all of our affirmative cases for review has shortened the process on the end. Then he also has talked about, in this chapter 6, talked about complex situations, mixed interreligious marriages, same-sex unions, and single parents. And also he speaks about death as a family experience, the impact that death can have on a family. Chapter 7 deals with a better education of children. And here he emphasizes the family as the primary educational setting, the primary teachers of the children, with many practical recommendations to parents, including some on the value of correction and patient realism. Those are actually kind of interesting to read. And also the necessity of sex education from the Catholic perspective. He has several paragraphs that deal with that. He emphasizes that it has to be from a Catholic perspective. It has to be presented, of course, the church teaching, but that it is necessary. It is something that we have to provide. And then he concluded by emphasizing that parents are the evangelizers of their own family. There's an evangelization function in the family. Once again, the idea that the family is a domestic church, that it plays an ecclesial function. Chapter 8, the accompanying discerning and integrating weakness, is what I'll be talking about for the rest of the talk. So I'll just skip over that for the moment, because that's the chapter that has caused the greatest discussion and really has the greatest practical impact. Chapter 9 is on the spirituality of marriage and the family, and he emphasizes that the family should possess a supernatural communion that reflects the life of the Holy Trinity. that the family is, it's a sacrament of Christ's love for the church, God's love for his people, but it also is a sacrament of the Holy Trinity. That communion that exists within the family is a reflection of the communion that exists among the three persons of the Trinity. He also, once again, emphasizes the importance of family prayer for nurturing that communion. And he also points out that God, and not the other spouse, must be the ultimate center of life for each member of a couple. That to the extent a husband or wife wants to see in their partner the fulfillment of all of their hopes and dreams at the beginning of their life, they're going to be disappointed because it's another human being. The marriage relationship is meant to reflect the love of God, but not substitute for it. And that for a healthy marriage to exist, there always has to be room for God, both in the combined life of the couple and also in their individual lives. He cites Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, who said that there's really a need for mutual disillusionment in a marriage, that a lot of the initial illusions that necessarily are part of going into a totally new situation like that do have to be dispersed in order for the couple to be able to start focusing on God as being the necessary completion of their relationship. He says this leads to a healthy autonomy of each of the spouses, so that while they depend heavily on each other, they each also have their own personal life, their own personal relationship with the Lord. He has a wonderful passage in which he speaks about family life as sharing God's dream, as co-creating God's dream for us. That part of it is really, really good to read. He speaks of family life as shepherding, in mercy and hospitality, and then he concludes with a prayer to the Holy Family. So that is the general outline of Amoris Laetitia, and it's pretty short. It's only about 170 pages altogether with these 9 chapters. Now, both in the sessions of the Synod that led up to Amoris Laetitia, and also in the following discussions that have taken place, there has been a tremendous focus on Chapter 8, which deals with accompanying, discerning, and integrating weakness. And it's unfortunate that there's been so much emphasis on that, because it has caused a neglect of all those other parts of the document that are very much in line with past teaching, and that also express that teaching in ways that are very beautiful and very pastoral. But of course, we all know that in the time leading up to Joy of Love, one of the great discussions had to do with the situation of Catholics who had been married and then were divorced and remarried outside the church, or people who wanted to marry Catholics who had been divorced. And it caused quite a bit of controversy. And indeed, it's really been a matter of controversy for about the past 20 years or so. It's been a big discussion because of the fact that at the pastoral level, it's so common a situation. As I mentioned a few times when I was here, at any Sunday Eucharist, probably about a quarter to a third of the people in the pews are in a marriage situation that in some way is considered irregular by the church. Very common. And I always admire the people who are able to keep coming to church under those circumstances, especially since the normal teaching has been that they can't receive the sacraments, and yet they still come, they still are active in the church, they raise their children as Catholics. But that is what the Pope is trying to address in Chapter 8. And so I'm going to quote a good part of this because he says it a lot better than I could ever summarize it. But he, first of all, emphasizes that there's a realization on the part of the church that any breach of the marriage bond is against the will of God. That it is sinful in some way. But also a consciousness of the frailty of so many people who are called to try to recognize that ideal, the church's teaching on marriage. And here he states, illumined by the gaze of Jesus Christ, the church turns with love to those who participate in her life in an incomplete manner. Once again, that's a kind of new terminology, an incomplete manner. He doesn't say these are adulterers, these are fornicators. He says that they participate in an incomplete manner, recognizing that the grace of God works also in their lives by giving them the courage to do good, to care for one another in love, and to be of service to the community in which they live and work. And then he says, although she constantly holds up the call to perfection and asks for a fuller response to God, the church must accompany with attention and care the weakest of her children, who show signs of a wounded and troubled love, by restoring in them hope and confidence, like the beacon of a lighthouse in a port, or a torch carried among the people to enlighten those who have lost their way or who are in the midst of a storm. And then he uses an image that he's used in a number of contexts. Let us not forget that the church's task is often like that of a field hospital. We're not trying by any chance to restore things to the perfect way, just as a field hospital generally can't restore somebody who's injured in a war or natural disaster to perfect health, but we try to take care as well as we can of what has happened. And he then goes on to say Christian marriage, as a reflection of the union between Christ and his church, is fully realized in the union between a man and a woman who give themselves to each other in a free, faithful, and exclusive love, who belong to each other until death and are open to the transmission of life, and are consecrated by the sacrament, which grants them the grace to become a domestic church and a leaven of new life for societies. And there he once again summarizes the church teaching on what marriage is and what it's for. Some forms of union radically contradict this ideal, while others realize it in at least a partial and analogous way. The Synod Fathers, the bishops at the Synod, stated that the Church does not disregard the constructive elements in those situations, which do not yet or no longer correspond to her teaching on marriage. And again, this is in itself a departure, just in an approach, because to recognize any positive elements in an irregular marriage situation in the past was generally not done, or at least not supposed to be done. Now, at the pastoral level, most of us have had to do that. I mean, recognize that so many irregular marriages have wonderful relationships between spouses, they're raising the kids well, but sort of the official approach was always that our job ultimately is to get rid of that situation in some way. And this is something that is very different from that approach. He emphasizes gradualness in pastoral care. He says that civil marriages and cohabitation can have positive elements that can lead to evangelization and spiritual growth. For example, he says, here. The fathers also considered the specific situation of merely civil marriage, or with due distinction, even simple cohabitation, noting that when such unions attain a particular stability, legally recognized, or are characterized by deep affection and responsibility for their offspring, and demonstrate an ability to overcome trials, they can provide occasions for pastoral care with a view to the eventual celebration of the sacrament of marriage. And so that is something, there's been a difference of opinion among many pastors. There's some who say that if a couple is cohabitating, that they need to stop doing that before they can get married in the church, that once they do that, they can't get married in the church. Whereas others are saying, well, actually what we want is for them to get married. We don't want to break them up necessarily. We want them to get married, and to require them to break up before they can get married would make it harder for them eventually to enter a regular situation. They'd be more likely to enter an even more irregular situation by entering a marriage outside the church. And so this is kind of what they're recognizing here. He then says that on the other hand, it is a source of concern that many young people today distrust marriage and live together, putting off indefinitely the commitment of marriage, while yet others break a commitment already made and immediately assume a new one. He says that for the church's pastors, are not only responsible for promoting Christian marriage, but also the pastoral discernment of the situations of a great many who no longer live this reality. Entering into pastoral dialogue with these persons is needed to distinguish elements in their lives that can lead to a greater openness to the gospel of marriage in its fullness. In this pastoral discernment, there is a need to identify elements that can foster evangelization and human and spiritual growth. And here he introduces the idea of pastoral accompaniment. And this is something that is very central to the approach that he eventually invites us to in dealing with irregular marriage situations. Because sometimes when any loosening of the discipline of excluding them totally from the sacraments is discussed, the thought is that they can then independently decide whether their situation meets that or not, and then come to the sacraments. And what he's saying here, what he continues to develop in the course of the document, is know that all of that has to be in the context of a process of accompaniment, a pastoral and spiritual accompaniment in which a priest is involved. And that it's not something that can be unilaterally decided by the couple themselves. So he introduces that idea here. And then he also recognizes the variety of circumstances, including poverty, that can lead to de facto unions. Whatever the case, all these situations require a constructive response, seeking to transform them into opportunities that can lead to the full reality of marriage and family in conformity with the gospel. These couples need to be welcomed and guided patiently and discreetly. This is how Jesus treated the Samaritan woman. He addressed her desire for true love in order to free her from the darkness in her life and bring her to the full joy of the gospel. One of the things the Pope recognizes here is that sometimes, because of situations in particular countries, there's a prejudice against religious marriage. And in addition, many times, and actually I run into this here in our diocese quite a bit, a couple doesn't want to have a religious ceremony until they have the money for the party, basically, for the celebration, for the full-fledged celebration of the church. And so they'll often enter civil marriage first, and then they say, well, they will plan to have a church marriage later on. It's something that's contrary to church teaching, very much, unless they live separately. But it's something that's very common in many countries. Is just a part of the culture. It's something that, especially young people, aren't really in a position to resist. And then he says this about the law of gradualness. Along these lines, St. John Paul II proposed the so-called law of gradualness, in the knowledge that the human being knows, loves, and accomplishes moral good by different stages of growth. This is not a gradualness of law, but rather a gradualness in the prudential exercise of free acts on the part of subjects who are not in a position to understand, appreciate, or fully carry out the objective demands of the law. So he's saying the law is there, the rule is there, the ideal is there, but our ability to either understand it, or to know why it's important, or even to physically carry it out, might be limited. For the law itself is a gift of God which points out the way, a gift for everyone without exception. It can be followed with the help of grace, even though each human being advances gradually with progressive integration of the gifts of God and the demands of God's definitive and absolute love in his or her entire personal and social life. Once again, the introduction of this principle of gradualness is one that has been somewhat controversial since Amoris Laetitia was issued, because it's often viewed as kind of a laxism, saying that people don't have to worry if they feel that they're not able or willing to. And once again, you have to remember that this is in the context of a pastoral accompaniment in which a certain level of pressure is being put on the couple to develop, to open themselves to other ways of thinking, to other ways of living. But he says that the idea that a couple can immediately stop everything that's wrong with their current relationship and either enter one that is regular or break up, he says that's not the way that God works in us. The Lord works through gradual transformation. The process of conversion in this, as in all other aspects of our lives, is a gradual one. And he then goes on to, he says, calls the discernment of irregular situations. And very noteworthy is that he places the word irregular in quotes. In the past, when he talked about irregular marriage situations, it's kind of a nice way of saying, somebody's been divorced and remarried, but he puts it in quotes there, indicating that's kind of a term that can be used for them, but maybe not the ideal term. But it's very interesting that he puts that in quotes. And he says, the Synod addressed various situations of weakness or imperfection. Here I would like to reiterate something I sought to make clear to the whole Church, lest we take the wrong path. There are two ways of thinking which recur throughout the Church's history: casting off and reinstating. The Church's way, from the time of the Council of Jerusalem, has always been the way of Jesus, the way of mercy and reinstatement. The way of the Church is not to condemn anyone forever. It is to pour out the balm of God's mercy on all those who ask for it with a sincere heart. For true charity is always unmerited, unconditional, and gratuitous. Consequently, there is a need to avoid judgments which do not take into account the complexity of various situations, and to be attentive by necessity to how people experience distress because of their condition. This emphasis on reinstatement as opposed to condemnation is tremendously important, because this has been the crux of so much of the debate over how to approach the situation of divorced and remarried Catholics, or those who want to marry divorced Catholics. And that is, do we hold them to the full standard of the Church's doctrine on marriage? And always, if they fail to do that, exclude them from the sacraments. So that has been the official view for at least the past 20 years. Or is there some leeway that at the same time we emphasize that a situation is irregular, that a situation is not in conformity with the Church's teaching? Is it necessary that the remedy for that always include exclusion from the sacraments? And that's the distinction that has to be drawn here, because sometimes it's claimed that to admit somebody who's in a regular marriage situation to confession and communion is basically to deny the Church's teaching on marriage. And it's not. What it is to change the disciplinary rule that applies that. What the Pope is saying is that there's a lot about marriage that is divinely revealed and that we have to believe as Catholics, but that the exclusion of people who don't meet that ideal from communion and the other sacraments is not part of that divinely revealed belief. It's a disciplinary rule that in some cases must give way to other considerations. And so that's why he's emphasizing that he's saying that this is part of the idea, as he said, it's so excellent that he says the way of the Church is not to condemn anyone forever, because that has been the experience of many people in these irregular situations, that no matter how good they are as Catholics, no matter how much they go to church, no matter how much they believe, no matter how well they raise their children, that basically they were told, unless you break up your current marriage, you can't receive the sacraments. And from their standpoint, that's a perpetual penalty, which isn't supposed to exist in the Church if a person is truly sincere and repentant. And yet that has been the effect. So that's why he chose that particular language, because it was very clear in the course of the Synod that that's been a common experience throughout the world, that people in these irregular marriage situations feel singled out for permanent punishment, when even somebody commits a murder, can be forgiven and returned to the sacraments. And the rejoinder has always been, well, they're still in a state of sin. So if they just leave that state of sin, then everything will be okay. Forgetting that leaving that state of sin can sometimes involve other evils, including evils for the children and even for the two people in that irregular union. That is what he's presenting in this particular paragraph. And then he goes on to say, it is a matter of reaching out to everyone, of needing to help each person find his or her proper way of participating in the ecclesial community, and thus to experience being touched by an unmerited, unconditional, and gratuitous mercy. No one can be condemned forever, because that is not the logic of the gospel. Here I am not speaking only of the divorced and remarried, but of everyone in whatever situation they find themselves. Then he goes on, this is something that's very important, because this also happens. Naturally, if someone flaunts an objective sin as if it were part of the Christian ideal, or wants to impose something other than what the church teaches, he or she can in no way presume to teach or preach to others. This is a case of something which separates from the community. So he's distinguishing here the situation of those who recognize that they've sinned, that they're in an irregular situation, but they still want somehow to be able to maintain their relationship with the church, and those who say, well, I got married again, but that was fine. That's what God really wanted for me. It's actually was much more in accordance with what Jesus would want me to do, and that sort of thing. They present that as kind of the ideal, and that's what he's warning against. And believe me, we run into those situations too, in which somebody abandons their spouse, runs off with somebody else, and they think that's fine because they subjectively felt called to that, in quotes. And they themselves, that's what God was calling them to, and we say, no, in that situation, you have to wait a while before we can really even start talking, because a person in that situation is not even ready to start discerning. And says such a person needs to listen once more to the gospel message and is called to conversion. And then he goes on to say that as for the way of dealing with different irregular situations, the Synod Fathers reached a general consensus, which I support. And considering a pastoral approach toward people who have contracted a civil marriage, who are divorced and remarried, or simply living together, the Church has the responsibility of helping them understand the divine pedagogy of grace, one of the few Vatican terms that he uses here, in their lives, and offering them assistance so they can reach the fullness of God's plan for them, something which is always possible by the power of the Holy Spirit. What he's saying is that, in the end, our ideal is to help couples in these irregular situations somehow to get into a situation that is regular, in which they are in conformity with the teachings of the Church. How to do that will vary, and sometimes they'll never be fully possible, at least within a lifetime of both of those people. Sometimes it might require a declaration of nullity or other action by the Church that for some reason is not possible right now. Sometimes it's because a non-Catholic party doesn't want to get annulment. They're the ones who need it. The spouse can't do it for them. But he's saying that ultimately our hope is that everyone goes into a situation that is in conformity with the teaching of the Church, even though we know that in this, as in all other areas of morality, that's not something that's ever going to be achieved in this world. And then he goes on to say that the divorced who have entered a new union, for example, can find themselves in a variety of situations which should not be pigeonholed or fit into overly rigid classifications, leaving no room for suitable personal and pastoral discernment. One thing is a second union consolidated over time with new children, proven fidelity, generous self-giving, Christian commitment, a consciousness of its irregularity and the great difficulty of going back, without feeling in conscience that one would fall into new sins. The Church acknowledges situations where, for serious reasons, such as the children's upbringing, a man and a woman cannot satisfy the obligation to separate. There are also the cases of those who have made every effort to save their first marriage and were unjustly abandoned, or of those who have entered into a second union for the sake of the children's upbringing and are sometimes subjectively certain in conscience that their previous and irreparably broken marriage had never been valid. Another thing is a new union arising from a recent divorce, and here he's contrasting this with a new union arising from a recent divorce with all the suffering and confusion this entails for children and entire families, or the case of someone who has consistently failed with his obligations to the family. It must remain clear that this is not the ideal which the Gospel proposes for marriage and the family. And as the Synod Fathers stated, that discernment of pastors must always take place by adequately distinguishing with their approach with carefully discerned situations. We know that no easy recipes exist. This is another topic that he has followed up on in subsequent months, that priests and seminarians have to develop a gift of discernment. And it's real easy to say, you're not in conformity with church teaching on marriage, therefore you can't go to communion, as opposed to saying, well, that is this a case where they can or not? That's where it gets hard. And it's really because it is hard is one of the reasons that many pastors are uncomfortable with having to do that, and are wondering, well, how can we make the right decision? And what Pope Francis is saying is, well, we have to make a decision and hope that it's right. It's not always going to be, but it's something that we have to do with the gift of discernment. And then he goes on to say, I'm in agreement with the many synod fathers who observe that the baptized who are divorced and similarly remarried need to be more fully integrated into Christian communities in the variety of ways possible while avoiding any occasion of scandal. The logic of integration is the key to their pastoral care, a care which would allow them not only to realize that they belong to the church as the body of Christ, but also to know that they can have a joyful and fruitful experience in it. They are baptized, they are brothers and sisters. The Holy Spirit pours into their hearts gifts and talents for the good of all. Their participation can be expressed in different ecclesial services, which necessarily requires discerning which of the various forms of exclusion currently practiced in the liturgical, pastoral, educational, and institutional framework can be surmounted. This is real important because, again, in most parishes and most dioceses, if a person's in an irregular marriage situation, they can't hold certain ministries in the church. They can't be electors, they can't be Eucharistic ministers of necessity. Sometimes they can't be they can't be catechists. And so he's calling that into question and saying we have to discern that as well. Such persons need to feel not as excommunicated members of the church, but instead as living members, able to live and grow in the church and experience her as a mother who welcomes them always, who takes care of them with affection and encourages them along the path of life and the gospel. This integration is also needed in the care and Christian upbringing of their children, who ought to be considered the most important. And then he goes on to say, if we consider the immense variety of concrete situations, such as those I have mentioned, it is understandable that neither the synod nor this exhortation can be expected to provide a new set of general rules, canonical in nature and applicable to all cases. Many people thought that he was going to come up with a new set of canons or other principles that we'd be able to apply. And you say, no, the variety of cases is too big for that. That we can. This is one of those cases where we have to take general principles and apply them in particular situations without necessarily having written rules at that level of detail. He then says, what is possible is simply a renewed encouragement to undertake a responsible personal and pastoral discernment of particular cases, one which would recognize that since the degree of responsibility is not equal in all cases, the consequences or effect of a rule need not necessarily always be the same. Priests have the duty to accompany the divorced and remarried in helping them to understand their situation according to the teaching of the church and the guidelines of the bishop. Useful in this process is an examination of conscience through moments of reflection and repentance. The divorced and remarried should ask themselves, how did they act toward their children when the conjugal union entered into crisis? Whether or not they made attempts at reconciliation? What has become of the abandoned party? What consequences the new relationship has on the rest of the family and the community of the faithful? And what example is being set for young people who are preparing for marriage? A sincere reflection can strengthen trust in the mercy of God, which is not denied anyone. So he's saying that in many and perhaps most situations, if a couple of the situations really examines their conscience, they might well find that this is a situation that is that somehow needs to be changed, and it might not be necessarily with breaking up the relationship itself, but it might have to do with the way the children or the former spouse are treated, or other effects that this has had on the community. What we're speaking of is a process of accompaniment and discernment which guides the faithful to an awareness of their situation before God. Conversation with the priest in the internal forum contributes to the formation of a correct judgment on what hinders the possibility of a fuller participation in the life of the church, and on what steps can foster it and make it grow. Given that gradualness is not in the law itself, this discernment can never prescind from the gospel demands of truth and charity as proposed by the church. For this discernment to happen, the following conditions must necessarily be present: humility, discretion and love for the church and her teaching, and a sincere search for God's will, and a desire to make a more perfect response to it. These attitudes are essential for avoiding the grave danger of misunderstandings, such as the notion that any priest can quickly grant exceptions, or that some people can obtain sacramental privileges in exchange for favors. When a responsible and tactful person who does not presume to put his or her own desires ahead of the common good of the church meets with a pastor capable of acknowledging the seriousness of the matter before him, there can be no risk that a specific discernment may lead people to think that the church maintains a double standard. So once again, he's emphasizing this is supposed to be a very structured process with the involvement of a priest, and that it has to involve a very honest confrontation of the truth of what's going on in that relationship as it relates to the teachings of the church on marriage. Now, for an adequate understanding, he goes on to mitigating factors and pastoral discernment. This turns out to be kind of central. For an adequate understanding of the possibility and need for special discernment in certain irregular situations, one thing must always be taken into account, lest anyone think the demands of the gospel are in any way being compromised. The Church possesses a solid body of reflection concerning mitigating factors and situations. Hence, it can no longer simply be said that all those in any irregular situation are living in a state of mortal sin and are deprived of sanctifying grace. More is involved here than mere ignorance of the rule. A subject may know full well the rule, yet have great difficulty in understanding its inherent values, or be in a concrete situation which does not allow him or her to act differently and decide otherwise without further sin. As the Sin Fathers put it, factors may exist which limit the ability to make a decision. And then he goes on to say, and this is where I have to remember, those of us who are raised with the Baltimore Catechism might remember that for a mortal sin, there are 3 requirements. One of those is grave matter, that what has been done is something that's very, very serious, and we can assume that that's always present in these situations of second marriages. The problem is, as far as saying that all of these people are in mortal sin, is that the other 2 requirements are not always, or even perhaps in most cases, met. That there has to be perfect knowledge that it's serious, and why it's serious, and that it truly is something that offends God very, very badly in this particular circumstance. And also there has to be full consent, that a person has to be free to choose the behavior or not. And it's in those areas that the Pope is speaking. That there's no questioning the grave matter. He's questioning the subjective elements that are involved. And simply pointing out, as has been pointed out for years now, that you can't speak about all the people in these irregular situations as being in a state of mortal sin. They might have committed a sin, a venial sin with grave matter, but not in all situations will it be a mortal sin. And that's something that makes a big, big difference when you talk about access to the sacraments, because if a person is in a state of mortal sin, then they can't receive the sacraments no matter what their sin was, whether it's being divorced or remarried or what. And so what he's saying here is that not all of these people are in that state. And then he goes on to quote the Catechism of the Catholic Church on this matter, and he also goes ahead and he quotes a number of other documents that have come out on this. Now, he then goes on to rules and discernment, and he says it's reductive something to consider whether or not an individual's actions correspond to a general law or rule, because that's not enough to discern and ensure full fidelity to God in the concrete life of a human being. I earnestly ask that we always recall the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and learn to incorporate it in our pastoral discernment. Although there is necessity in the general principles, the more we descend to matters of detail, the more frequently we encounter defects. In matters of action, truth or practical rectitude is not the same for all as to matters of detail, but only to the general principles. And where there is the same rectitude in matters of detail, it is not equally known to all. The principle will be found to fail according as we descend further into detail. What he's referring to here is something that any of us who are lawyers are familiar with, that there's no way that a general rule can take into account every single particular situation. That at some point there has to be some discretion in how you apply it to a particular situation, and that is something that can be real hard. And what he's saying, what he's laying the groundwork for is to say that concluding that because a person has objectively violated the standards of the Church concerning marriage, that they are automatically excluded from communion, that's getting into too much detail that the law isn't designed to handle. That is something that requires some discretion on the part of those responsible for applying the law. Now notice that Neil is going up to the camera, which indicates that my time is running short, and so what I'd like to do is to move from Amoris Laetitia itself to the most recent interpretation of that document by Pope Francis. And it's something that, fortunately for me, occurred only a couple of weekends ago. what happened is there's been a lot of, as I mentioned before, all sorts of questions about how to interpret it because of the fact that Pope Francis makes references in footnotes to some of the important principles. There was some question, well, is this really fine? Is this really meant to be applied the way that I've interpreted it right now? And so what happened is that back on September 5th, the bishops of the Buenos Aires, the pastoral region where Pope Francis is from, sent a series of basic criteria for the application of Chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. And what they did was to outline the way they were going to apply it in their region if the Pope approved. And so it says, in the first place, we recall it is not convenient to speak of permission to receive the sacraments, but rather a process of discernment accompanied by a pastor. It's a personal and pastoral discernment. On the journey, the pastor should accentuate the fundamental announcement, the kerygma, the basic Christian proclamation, that stimulates or renews the personal encounter with the living Christ. The pastoral accompaniment is an exercise in the Via Caritatis. It is an invitation to follow the way of Jesus, that of mercy and integration. This route demands the pastoral charity of the priest who welcomes the penitent, listens to him attentively, and shows him the maternal face of the church, at the same time accepting his upright intention and his good purpose, or of arranging his whole life in accordance with the light of the gospel and the practice of charity. This journey does not end necessarily in the sacraments, but rather can be oriented to other ways of being better integrated into the life of the church. A greater presence in the community, participation in groups of prayer or reflection, commitment to various ecclesial services, etc. When the concrete circumstances of a couple make it feasible, especially when both are Christians with a journey of faith, it is possible to propose that they make the effort of living in continence. Amoris Laetitia does not ignore the difficulties of this option and leaves open the possibility of receiving the sacrament of reconciliation when one fails in this intention. That is, when a couple has agreed that they will not have sexual relations, and that has been one exception. In that case, when that has been verified, they have been able to receive communion, even though other people might not know about it. And here he's saying that if a couple messes up, if they fall, that they can go to confession, have that forgiven, and then return to the sacraments, that's been pretty standard teaching. And then he says, in other more complex circumstances, when it is not possible to obtain a declaration of nullity, the aforementioned option may not in fact be feasible. Nonetheless, it is equally possible to undertake a journey of discernment if one arrives at the recognition that in a particular case there are limitations that diminish responsibility and culpability, particularly when a person judges that he would fall into a subsequent fault by damaging the children of the new union. Amoris Laetitia opens up the possibility of access to the sacrament of reconciliation and the Eucharist. These in turn dispose the person to continue maturing and growing with the aid of grace. One thing noteworthy here is that it's still a prerequisite to try to get an annulment. That has to be, they have to exhaust that possibility first. It's not like this real is going to allow everybody to omit the annulment process from now on. And then, however, it is necessary to avoid misunderstanding this possibility of unrestricted access to the sacraments, as though any situation might justify it, but is proposed as a discernment that adequately distinguishes each case. And then he goes on to a few of the examples that the Pope had cited before. It's always important to guide people to place themselves with their conscience before God, and for this purpose, the examination of conscience, as proposed by Amoris Laetitia, is useful, especially where it refers to how they have behaved towards their children or towards the abandoned spouse. When there were unresolved injustices, the access to the sacraments is particularly scandalous. So he's saying there are a lot of cases where this isn't even going to come up. And they go on to say that in some cases, the access to the sacrament might be brought about in a reserved way. Perhaps in a situation where there's a choice of parishes, a couple might go to another parish to receive the sacraments or something like that. Anything that might prevent a perception that the church is backing off on its teaching on the indissolubility of matrimony. And then it points out that discernment is never finished because it's dynamic and must always remain open to new stages of growth and new decisions that permit the realization of the ideal in a fuller way, in accordance with the law of gradualness and trusting in the help of grace. What happened is Pope Francis got this draft from the Argentine bishops, and then he wrote a letter back to them, the same day, in fact, and he said, the document is very good and completely explains the meaning of Chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. There are no other interpretations, and I am certain that it will do much good. May the Lord reward this effort of pastoral charity. And it is precisely pastoral charity that moves us to go out to encounter those who are at a distance, and once found, to start down the road of welcome, accompaniment, discernment, and integration into the ecclesial community. We know that this is tiresome, that it entails a pastoral approach person to person that isn't satisfied with programmatic, organizational, or legal interventions, however necessary they may be. Simply to welcome, accompany, discern, integrate. Of these four pastoral attitudes, the least cultivated and practiced is discernment. And I consider formation in discernment, both personal and communal, in our seminaries and presbyteries to be an urgent matter. And finally, I would like to recall that Amoris Laetitia was the fruit of the labor and prayer of the whole Church with the mediation of 2 synods and of the Pope. For this reason, I recommend a complete catechesis of the exhortation that will certainly aid in the growth, consolidation, and sanctity of the family. And that is the ultimate hope that all of us have, is we want to strengthen our families. Many times we do disagree as to what's the best way to do that. Pope Francis has indeed offered out some possibilities that weren't very obviously there before. And of course, as a pastor, I view that as an opportunity, but also with the necessary caution and the idea that this is a matter of discernment that must always take place within the structure of the Church, in which nobody can make the judgment on their own. And so that's it. I just want to thank you for sitting through a little bit longer than we had.